Our next speaker is Andrew Scott, and I'd really like to welcome him to the stage. Dr. Andrew Scott is Associate Professor in Politics and Policy at Deakin University here in Melbourne. He is an author of 5 books and numerous chapters and articles on aspects of politics, policy and history, frequently involving international comparisons. His latest book, Northern Lights, outlines practical lessons which Australia can learn and apply from Denmark's investment in the active labour market. And he's going to speak to us today about that one. Please welcome Andrew to the stage.
Thank you. I'm, unlike John, I'm not going to use PowerPoints. I'm a bit of a traditionalist, even though we're talking about rapid change in technology and employment, although I saw some of the limitations of that when I was a few minutes late this morning because the cab dropped me at the other end of the convention centre, which is quite a long way away actually, and the response to that might be to, like many other people seem to be doing, turn to Uber as a salvation. Uber is going to fix so many problems for us, apparently, including the traditional taxi industry, which is supposed to be some very old, regulated industry, and yet we know that taxi drivers don't get paid much. We know that the owners of taxi companies are very agile in avoiding responsibilities to employees, designating them in very innovative ways as bailees and so on to avoid paying entitlements. So I think more nuances in our debate about the nature of change, what is changing, what isn't changing, is very important. Technological change is occurring, but that should not be used to disguise an older agenda of having higher unemployment as a curb on wages and restricting employees' opportunities, which some have pursued from an ideological perspective. The two are different things. Now, technology brings opportunities as well as threats. Now, clearly the closure of the car industry is catastrophic for Australia, and I do believe it was unnecessary. I think that it was likely that there would have been a departure of some car companies, but not all, and it's most unfortunate. I'm here to talk about the Nordic nations and what we can practically learn from those. The first point I make is that they are relevant to us. Globalisation is a slogan that's used a lot, but many of the people who use it then simply turn to a comparison with Britain and America and say, well, we're not doing as bad as them, therefore we're doing well. That is not globalisation. Globalisation means looking at all the countries in the world and particularly looking at those that have had sustained successes in policy areas. And Denmark is interesting in this respect because it has had success in reducing long-term unemployment, in having a lower unemployment rate than Australia for nearly all the years of the last 2 decades, through its investment in active labour market programs. Like Australia, when the 1990s recession came, Denmark set up active labour market program opportunities, or rather, increased them. Australia did so too, although somewhat late, 1994 with Working Nation, and then with a change of government they were quickly dismantled. And one of the reasons given for dismantling them was that they hadn't produced immediate results. Of course, it's rather difficult to produce immediate results with very long-term unemployed people who face multiple barriers to workforce participation, retraining and so on, especially if you measure it in very narrow terms, i.e. they have to have been placed in an unsubsidised private sector job within 3 months of completing the program. That's the basis on which the Working Nation programs were dismantled. I'm not saying that they were perfect, they could have been modified and redesigned, but the point is that Denmark kept such programs going, and that succeeded in reducing unemployment below Australia consistently over a 2-decade period from the early 90s until the global financial crisis in all but 1 year. So I think Denmark is of relevance in that respect. It's also relevant because it's a first world economy, and Mr Turnbull, new Prime Minister, has emphasised that we want our agility to occur in a fair and secure first world economy in which the labour movement has a role, and that there has to be enough of a taxation revenue base to pay to support those in need. And among those in need are clearly displaced workers, and the areas of need include investment in real quality skills training programs. I'm sorry to say that work for the dole isn't one of those. I think work for the dole is a gimmick that should be consigned to history. It was always more of a political than a economic program, and it would be good to give people who are long-term unemployed some real reskilling opportunities. In my analysis of the comparisons with Denmark and Australia, a few interesting things came up. One is that the framework of our employment services is such that it is punitive compared to Denmark's. It encourages case managers to be punitive and to be narrow in what they do. We know there are distortions in our employment services to get outcomes, financial outcomes, for placing relatively easy to place unemployed people rather than helping those with deeper needs. This is a problem, and it's part of a bigger problem, I think, and we've had debate in Australia about the level of the unemployment payment. We've seen the stark statistics about Australia. Its unemployment payment is approximately 40% of a replacement income. In Denmark, an unemployment payment is more like 90% of a replacement income. Now, that doesn't mean that unemployment becomes an attractive long-term option for workers who can get almost as much by being unemployed. What it means is that a network of unemployment insurance funds covers about 3/4 of the Danish workforce. Workers opt into them. They have been associated with trade unions, and they have come about through a period of long social democratic government, and in societies, Denmark, like Sweden, like Norway, where trade unions are respected participants in tripartite policy decision making. But nevertheless, the important thing is that they have proved effective, because in effect, Danish workers are insured against unemployment. We insure against old age with pension and superannuation. We insure against ill health with Medicare. We now insure against disability with the NDIS. It seems to me, if it's true, as Mr Turnbull says, and as technological predictions show, that we are going through into an even more rapid period of job turnover and change, that we need to insure against the periods of transition involved in that more comprehensively than we do. I think the idea of an unemployment insurance policy or a network of unemployment insurance funds in Australia is one of the next big pieces of social infrastructure we need to talk about, whereby people opt in, and so being unemployed or being a displaced worker doesn't put you into a pit of financial despair, of poverty, from which the only response is to try to climb out as quickly as possible through lesser paid work, insecure work, rather than do as they do in Denmark, which is to have a sufficient financial base to substantially reskill, a time of repositioning rather than despair. Reskill from a satisfactorily secure financial base, and that opens up possibilities about the extent of reskilling that can occur. For example, it is possible for some male, middle-aged, blue-collar workers to be retrained to do different roles in areas that are growing. And that might be in human services, for example. It's not inconceivable. Obviously, it depends a lot on the individuals and the cultures involved, but why should we rule that possibility out? Perhaps the clearest example I saw in Denmark of the contrast of their approach was the closure of the Lindo shipyard in the city of Odense in southern Denmark a few years ago, where 8,000 direct and indirect jobs were lost. A privately owned shipyard was closed, and instead of, as we do with car companies in Adelaide or Geelong, Broadmeadows and so on, turning towards the individual workers and looking at them as individuals, and perhaps in the case of Geelong and Elizabeth, or in a non-car industry case, the Latrobe Valley, directing them to other places of better employment prospects. The Lindo shipyard in Odense in Denmark was transformed into a new renewable energy centre, which re-employed many of the former shipbuilding workers in the manufacture and operation of wind turbines, which Denmark has embraced as part of embracing renewable energy on a big scale. I don't know if anyone's been to Denmark recently. Some of you will have watched Borgen or the bridge. I actually was disappointed when I went to Copenhagen on the last visit. I was expecting to see a lot of action on the bridge. I crossed the bridge, very scenic, but no corpses, no, nothing like that. But wind turbines are visible in all directions in Copenhagen. They weren't a few years ago, they are now. Denmark has embraced wind energy, and this is creating employment as well as environmental benefits. That's a very important point. And it is helping workers adjust to a proximate sector of employment growth. Now, what would be an equivalent for Australia? I think clearly we're not as windy as Denmark, but we are more sunny. And we're more sunny than Germany, and yet Germany is way ahead of us in its harnessing of the employment opportunities from solar power. We can do a lot more in solar power on a large scale. Obviously, the first step is to have some recognition of the importance of, well, the reality of climate change is occurring, and that employment in fossil fuel industries has less of a future. The Victorian government has set out an industry plan whereby it is embracing renewable energy for jobs as well as environmental reasons. And I think that is a good approach which can be extended nationally and needs to be. The costs of investing in the short term in active labour market programs, that needs to be quantified against the costs of not investing, i.e. the costs of long-term unemployment, which take into account obviously the health problems, the morale, the mental health issues, psychological problems, but also the loss of workforce participation by these people still of prime age, lost productivity, lost revenue from the taxes they will pay when they are re-employed in the paid workforce. The participation rates in the paid labour force in Denmark of so-called older workers up to the age of 54 have long been consistently higher than in Australia. So contrary to the idea, if you provide financial benefits for those who are unemployed or on leave, that they will malinger, take advantage of those and never return to the workforce. In fact, this promotes higher re-entry to the workforce. If you help people through periods of transition with investment in reskilling, or in the case of paid parental leave, all the Nordic countries, particularly Sweden and Norway, give extensive paid parental leave, and the effect of that is that women are more likely to return to work, not less likely, because they have had the leave when they needed it most. They also have a framework of public, affordable early childhood education and care. Another interesting thing about the Danish approach to the unemployed is that they're moving away from an excessive emphasis on meeting procedural requirements, activity testing, numbers of interviews, letters written, that sort of thing, because they're thinking this obstructs outcomes and content. The interest is in getting results, not in tying people up in procedural knots. And they're even talking about rights that unemployed people have, which I think is an interesting contrast to the direction we have gone. There is debate about this in Denmark. The term flexicurity has sometimes been used by the OECD in particular to describe in a positive way Denmark's successes in this respect. The meaning of flexicurity is still contested between employers and unions. Unions emphasise that it means flexibility for workers, not of workers. And the approach, flexicurity can be misinterpreted if you take one of its three elements without the other two. The three elements are, firstly, there is a flexible labour market in Denmark, as there is in Australia. But there are generous levels of unemployment payment, and there is heavy investment in active labour market programs and reskilling opportunities. Australia has a flexible labour market too. Some people would like to be more flexible with less restriction on unfair dismissal and so on, but the rate of turnover and so on indicates that it's comparable to Denmark in flexibility, but it doesn't have those other two elements, which could build in some security. Flexicurity really means that a basis of security underpins people's flexibility between different jobs. So it's a notion of employment security, not job security. There's no idea in Denmark that people will hold the same job for life, but there is a notion that if they lose one job, they should be supported to transition into another job. And that should take account of which areas are rising as distinct from those which are declining. Denmark has never actually had a car industry. Sweden has, of course, but Denmark has had significant niches in shipbuilding and other manufacturing industry products. Sweden's success in having a car industry, although it's had its setbacks too with the departure of Saab, and Volvo still manufactures and exports heavy engineered buses and trucks, so does the Scania company. In fact, if you take a bus ride while you're in Melbourne or whichever state you've come from, you'll probably be getting on a Volvo bus. I always look for the brands. I'm just, become a bit of a habit for me. Volvo or Scania trucks and buses all over the road. So why would this small country, Sweden, 10 million people or so on the far northwest corner of the world, be making such huge items with high wages, high skill and so on? It wasn't entirely because, it wasn't by accident. I mean, it didn't happen because free markets were allowed to flourish without any sense of planning. It's a niche positioning of quality products, and the buses involved, for instance, have low floors that cater for people with disabilities. They move up and down and so on, which has given them attraction into other countries, and they're worth paying for. It's always interesting to notice in the financial press when you see often tirades against the so-called sclerosis of northern European economies, and Germany's often mentioned in this respect too, sclerosis. Then you look at the advertisements in the same papers, and there's lots of advertisements for get your quality German engineered products, get your Audis, BMWs, etc. There's something of a contradiction there. So I think Australia can learn from a wide range of countries, including the Northern European countries, and particularly the Nordic nations and Denmark's attitude to helping people cope for change by giving them a basis of financial security. The Lindo shipyard, I think, is an inspiring example which is relevant to the Latrobe Valley. It's relevant to other regions hard hit. In terms of the measurement and identification of the problems of regional disadvantage, other contributors to this forum will be talking about that. I think another important publication in recent times has been Tony Vinson's Jesuit Social Services report, Dropping Off the Edge, which updates and documents again the extent of disadvantage in particular areas. The example closest to my own university, Deakin, is Corio in the Geelong area. I noticed several people are talking about Geelong case studies as part of your program. Corio is one of the highest disadvantage areas measured by the Tony Vinson Jesuit Social Services report on many measures, not just unemployment, but other measures including family difficulties, child maltreatment, imprisonment rates and so on. And of course these are some of the costs of unemployment too, let's face it, which should be factored into any broad analysis. Another place that is mentioned in Vinson's report is Doveton in the outer southeastern suburbs of Melbourne near Dandenong, which was part of GMH when it was in its heyday as a car employer. And Doveton's been written about also by Dennis Glover in his book, An Economy is Not a Society. And Dennis Glover grew up in Doveton, and he's gone back, a la George Orwell in The Road to Wigan Pier, to the place of his youth where his father worked at GMH, his mother worked there as well, and his sister worked there. And there was a lot of secure employment in and good income for families and a good thriving community as a result of that. Going back to a place which he documents with great heartfelt disappointment of dereliction and despair, loss of hope. Now there's some danger in analysis like this, of course, that it could be seen as nostalgic for what is seen as a good old days, a golden age, which had, of course, its own problems. For a start, it was mostly male-dominated employment. It could be seen as nostalgic for the idea that only manufacturing jobs are real jobs. I don't think that's what Dennis is arguing, however. If you read his book carefully, I think he's arguing for the importance of employment in people's lives and treating people as human beings, not just as statistics. And one of the things that comes out of it, reading his book for me, is when we define skills, we need to have broader notions of skill. Now, trade unions in the past have successfully defined skill as close to what their members do. And skill often became associated with strength, physical strength, for a long time. And there's been very effective feminist critiques of masculine notions of skill. But one of the other things the Nordic countries have done is to challenge notions that certain types of work are not skilled. And this is relevant to the childcare, early childhood education and care debate, for example. We know we pay childcare workers very low in Australia, and yet do we really want to leave our children with anyone? Is being an early childhood education and care worker simply making sure the child is still there at the end of the day, hasn't run onto the freeway or something? Is that the job? Or do we not acknowledge the importance of studies which show that social learning takes place very importantly in that environment? As kids get outside the family environment and mix with other kids, this is absolutely crucial social learning at a most crucial part of their brain's development. And do we not therefore want highly skilled people? Surely we would want kind people involved with our children, patient people, people with empathy. Surely those are skills and should be recognised as skills. And so we need to broaden our notions of what are skills. Technological predictions of change have been coming a long time. I read Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. It came out in 1970. I read it a few years after that, but I was only about 13 when I read it. I thought, oh, this is interesting. The world's going to be different in the future. But I'm still waiting for that great age of leisure that was promised. And I've heard some of these predictions before, and I don't want to sound... it's good to have had some supportive comments from the Prime Minister about the situation of academics in recent days, but it certainly hasn't arrived in academia, the great age of leisure. We have to produce more. We have to do several jobs, research and administration, as well as teaching, fundraising, you name it. Diplomacy. Technology does destroy some jobs, but it can create others. It's a mixed story. It depends a lot on how individual nation states shape their destinies, and some countries do it better than others, and we need to learn from all countries. There's been some direct practitioners, including Roden Genoff, who worked in South Australia, and then he worked in the region of Elizabeth, north of Adelaide, and then went on to do some work for the OECD, including in Denmark, and who have been good sources of information about these comparisons. A colleague is currently in Denmark who's looking further into the unemployment insurance funds, how they operate, and receiving information from the Danish Ministry of Employment. And I think we need to say that the logical accompaniment of agility is some basis of security. We can't be agile if we're not prepared. We can't run on, weave onto a sports field, weave in and out as adeptly as the most skilled athletes unless we have some preparation, training, physical warm-up and so on. That would just cause further health problems if people started trying to be agile without proper preparation. So the accompaniment of agility is preparation, and if we are having greater job mobility and transition, we need to ensure against the transitions to income and employment that involves to make it affordable to reskill people. Another interesting thing about the Danish approach is its practical nature, recognition of prior learning. We know it's been a problem when there's been big closures in the past. I've read how with the Wollongong Steelworks closure, some former experienced workers had to be recertified in work that they were very experienced in doing. There wasn't enough discretion to take into account the practical experience. And you couldn't just take workers out of Wollongong or Newcastle, and you won't be able to take them out of the closing car making centres and put them into formal classroom environments and expect them to adapt. The learning opportunities must be sensitive, culturally appropriate, age appropriate, and so on. And we must be patient enough not to try and judge investment in employment reskilling opportunities by the shortest term quick fix we can get, statistical, cosmetic improvements, monthly figures, whatever, but rather by real results over a period of time that will boost labour force participation and therefore economic productivity and therefore social cohesion. Thank you.